Ash falls over the Aegean, a volcanic island tears itself apart, and across the sea, one of the most advanced civilizations of the Bronze Age begins to tremble. The Minoans built palaces, painted walls with dolphins and bulls, mastered trade routes, and turned Crete into a jewel of the ancient world. But nature was waiting beneath the sea. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if ancient mysteries like this are what you enjoy. Because this is the story of a civilization that did not simply vanish, it was transformed by disaster. Ash drifts across the Aegean like a second, darker weather, falling on rooftops, olive groves, harbours, ships, shrines, and courtyards where painted bulls still leap across palace walls. Somewhere beyond the southern horizon of the Cyclades, the island of Thera has torn itself open. The sea, usually a road of blue glass between Crete and the wider world, carries something else now floating pumice, broken timber, strange waves, rumours, silence. On Crete, people look northward from terraces and headlands, toward the place where one of the most violent volcanic eruptions of the Bronze Age has just transformed an island into a wound. They do not know that. Thousands of years later, scholars will sift ash layers, tsunami deposits, collapsed walls, pottery styles, tree rings, ice cores, and half-readable signs to ask whether this was the moment their world began to die. The Minoans are not a small footnote in someone else's story. They are among the most astonishing societies of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, a civilization of palace complexes, painted rooms, storerooms, workshops, ritual spaces, seagoing trade, and art so alive that even ruined fragments seem to breathe. Their cities do not look like the fortress kingdoms of mainland Greece. Their great centres do not bristle with the same kind of defensive walls. Their art does not obsess over marching armies or royal conquest. Instead, the surviving images show processions, dancers, women in elaborate dress, blue monkeys, saffron gatherers, dolphins, griffins, sacred horns, and the famous dangerous grace of bull leaping. It is a world that feels both intimate and unreachable, close enough to see the colours, distant enough that its language still refuses to speak clearly. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because the story of the Minoans is not only the story of a lost civilization, it is the story of how beauty, wealth, and sophistication can exist beside danger. How an island can become powerful because of the sea and vulnerable for the very same reason, and how nature can strike a world already balanced on invisible pressures. Crete sits like a long stone ship across the southern Aegean, with mountains rising from its spine and harbours opening toward Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, the Levant, and the Greek mainland. For centuries, this island becomes a centre of movement. Goods arrive from faraway metals, ivory, precious stones, ideas, styles, perhaps people whose names are lost. From Crete move oils, textiles, pottery, crafted objects, administrative practices, and a kind of cultural influence that leaves traces beyond its shores. The Minoans are not isolated dreamers painting dolphins on palace walls, while the rest of the Bronze Age roars past them. They are part of a connected Eastern Mediterranean, a world of ships, ports, exchanges, rivalries, and risks. And then comes the disaster that has haunted every modern telling of their history, the eruption of Thera, the volcanic island known today as Santorini. The eruption is not a minor local event. It throws ash high into the atmosphere, buries settlements under volcanic debris, reshapes the island, and sends material across the sea. At Akrotiri, on Thera itself, a town is preserved beneath volcanic layers with streets, houses, frescoes, storage jars, and signs of a society connected to Minoan Crete. The people there seem to have had warning because bodies have not been found in the way one might expect from a sudden entombment. What survives in the record suggests evacuation, preparation, or at least a moment of fear before the final destruction. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and the silence of those empty rooms is more unsettling than screams. For a long time, the story seemed almost too perfect in its drama. A brilliant island civilization rises, a volcano explodes, tsunamis smash the coasts, ash darkens the sky, crops fail, trade falters, palaces burn, the Minoans vanish. It is a narrative with the clean shape of myth, and perhaps that is part of why it has lasted so powerfully in the imagination. But archaeology rarely gives such simple endings. The truth is stranger, slower, and more difficult. The Minoan world does not disappear in a single afternoon. Some palace centres are damaged, rebuilt, reorganised, or abandoned at different times. Knossos continues to matter after the eruption. Minoan culture changes, but does not evaporate. Mycenaean Greek influence eventually appears on Crete, but how it arrives, whether through conquest, takeover, migration, alliance, elite imitation, or a mixture of forces, remains debated. No single explanation fully accounts for this collapse. Nature plays a role, perhaps a severe one. The eruption of Thera may have shaken the physical and economic foundations of Minoan power, especially if waves damaged ports, fleets, coastal settlements, and maritime infrastructure. Earthquakes may have struck before or after the eruption. Ashfall may have affected agriculture in some areas, though how deeply and where remains debated. Trade networks may have been disrupted. Political authority may have weakened. Rivals may have taken advantage. Internal tensions may have grown. The Minoan palaces, for all their elegance, depend on systems of storage, redistribution, craft production, ceremony, labour and exchange. When such systems are stressed, they may not break all at once. They may keep their shape for a while, like a wall cracked through its foundation, standing until the next tremor. This is where the mystery becomes more compelling than the legend. The Minoans are not merely destroyed by nature, they are transformed in the long shadow of nature. The eruption becomes one force among many, a shock that may expose weaknesses already present or create new ones that later generations cannot repair. Their decline is not only geological, it is social, economic, political, religious, and human. Somewhere in that tangled aftermath, people still plant fields, repair walls, move goods, seal jars, make offerings, and keep rituals alive. They do not experience collapse as a neat historical category. They experience it as uncertainty, a harbour that no longer works as before, a palace authority that no longer commands the same trust, a trade route that becomes dangerous, a harvest that fails, a familiar shrine that stands cracked, a foreign style appearing in local rooms, a new language entering administration. Modern eyes are drawn to the catastrophe because catastrophe leaves marks that can be measured. Volcanic ash can be traced, pumice can be identified, tsunami deposits can be studied, radiocarbon dates can be argued over. But the inner life of the Minoan world is harder to recover. Their main script, Linear A, remains undeciphered in any full, secure way. Their political titles, prayers, royal claims, legal disputes, hymns, and personal laments are mostly beyond reach. This is one reason their fall feels so haunting. The ruins are vivid, but the voices are locked behind signs. The walls show movement, colour, and ceremony, yet the civilization itself withholds its explanation. So the story begins not with a final answer, but with ash over the sea and a civilization standing at the edge of a changing world. The Minoans have already built something extraordinary before disaster enters the frame. To understand what nature may have destroyed and what it could not entirely erase, the path must first return to Crete itself, to the island at the centre of the Bronze Age sea, where mountains, harbours, palaces, and myths begin to gather into one of history's most enduring mysteries. Crete is not merely the stage on which the Minoan story unfolds, it is one of the main forces that shapes the story from the beginning. Seen from above, the island stretches long and narrow across the southern Aegean, with the sea pressing against it on every side and mountains rising sharply through its centre. Those mountains are not decoration. They divide the land into valleys, plateaus, passes, sheltered basins, and coastal plains. They make travel across the island difficult. But they also create many small worlds within one larger world. A village in a fertile valley, a harbour town facing the Cyclades, a settlement below a sacred peak, and a farming community near a palace centre may all belong to the same civilization. Yet each lives under slightly different skies, winds, soils, and dangers. This geography helps explain why Crete becomes so unusual. It is large enough to support complex societies, but surrounded enough to feel distinct. It is close enough to other Bronze Age cultures to exchange with them, but distant enough to develop its own style. To the north lie the Cycladic Islands, stepping stones across the Aegean. Farther north and west is mainland Greece, where other communities are growing in power. To the east are Rhodes, Cyprus, and the coasts of Anatolia and the Levant. To the south, across a wider stretch of sea, lies Egypt, one of the greatest powers of the ancient world. Crete sits between these regions like a listening post, a warehouse, a meeting place, and at times, perhaps a quiet rival. What survives in the record suggests that Minoan life is never purely local. Even when someone is grinding grain, pressing olives, shaping clay, or carrying jars through a palace corridor. The island's wider connections are never very far away. The sea gives Crete opportunity, but it also demands skill. To live here with ambition means learning the behaviour of winds, currents, seasonal sailing, safe anchorages, hidden reefs, and sudden storms. A ship leaving the northern coast does not sail into emptiness. It enters a web of familiar routes, where islands appear one after another, and distant contacts become possible. Copper, tin, gold, ivory, faience, lapis-coloured luxury, exotic animals, fine vessels, and artistic ideas move through the eastern Mediterranean in ways that are still being reconstructed. Scholars still debate the exact reach of Minoan political power beyond Crete, but there is little doubt that Minoan influence travels widely. Their pottery, artistic motifs, seals, and administrative habits appear beyond the island, not always as signs of control, but often as signs of prestige, imitation, exchange, or presence. The land itself offers a different foundation. Crete has fertile zones where grain can grow, hillsides suited for vines and olives, pastures for animals, and mountain resources that support local economies. The famous Mediterranean triad of grain, wine, and olive oil matters here, though it should not be imagined as simple abundance everywhere. The island's terrain is demanding, rainfall varies, some areas are generous, others harsh, terracing, storage, planning, and movement between ecological zones become important. A civilization built on Crete must learn how to manage unevenness. The palaces, when they arise, seem to sit within this system of gathering and redistribution, drawing in agricultural products and crafted goods, storing them in large jars, recording them with seals and scripts, and sending them out again through channels that are only partly understood. The mountains also carry religious weight. Later Greek tradition will remember Cretan caves as places tied to gods, births, hidden children, and ancient sacred power. Long before those stories take their later form, Minoan Crete already treats peaks, caves, springs, and natural features as charged places. Peak sanctuaries appear on high ridges, where offerings are left and small figurines accumulate. Caves hold ritual deposits in the deep, cool dark. The landscape is not divided neatly between nature and culture. A mountain is not just stone above a village. A cave is not just shelter. A spring is not merely water. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern suggests a world in which the island itself is alive with meaning. This matters because the Minoans are often remembered through their palaces, especially Knossos, with its painted corridors, courts, storerooms, and later mythic associations. Yet the palace centres are only part of a much wider island ecology. They rise because Crete allows them to rise, because the land can feed people, because the sea can connect them, because the mountains can divide and protect local identities, because harbours can gather foreign goods, and because the island's position gives it a role in the traffic of the Bronze Age. Minoan civilization is not born from isolation. It is born from controlled exposure. The island is open to the world, but not swallowed by it. One of the lesser-known details of this world is how deeply Minoan settlement patterns reflect both confidence and calculation. Many important sites are not placed like later fortresses on easily defended heights. Some are close to productive land, routes, ceremonial landscapes, or access points to the sea. This has sometimes led to the older idea of a peaceful Minoan thalassocracy, a sea power so secure that it did not need walls. That picture is too simple. There are fortified sites and defensive concerns in parts of the Minoan world, and the absence of massive walls at certain palaces does not prove the absence of violence. Still, the architecture suggests a society whose major centres are not designed primarily as grim military citadels. Their power seems to depend on movement, storage, display, ritual, and administration as much as on fear. Crete's location also means that disaster can travel toward it from every direction. Earthquakes are part of the region's deep geological reality. The same tectonic world that raises mountains and shapes coastlines can shake buildings apart. The sea that carries trade can also carry tsunamis. Winds that fill sails can spread ash. The island's strength and vulnerability are woven from the same threads. Its people become skilled at living with uncertainty. Perhaps so skilled that rebuilding after damage becomes almost ordinary. Archaeology shows repeated destructions, repairs, and reorganizations in the long history of Minoan sites. Not every collapse is the end. Sometimes broken walls are simply the beginning of another building phase. That habit of recovery is essential to the story. When later catastrophe arrives from Thera, it does not strike a weak and primitive island. It strikes a complex maritime civilization that has already learned to use geography as a source of wealth, identity, and power. Crete is the centre not because it stands above the Bronze Age sea like an empire in the modern sense, but because it gathers currents, people, goods, images, rituals, and ambitions pass through it. In its harbours and palace courts, the island turns connection into civilization, and from that same connection, the next great layer of the mystery begins to rise: the palace world itself, brilliant, organised, and still strangely difficult to define, a world of monumental centres that seem to hold power without showing clearly who holds the crown. Out of Crete's broken ridges and fertile pockets rises a kind of architecture that still feels difficult to name. The word palace is convenient, but it can mislead. It suggests a royal residence, a throne, a court gathered around a single ruler, a place where power flows from the person of a king. On Minoan Crete, the great complexes at Knossos, Phaistos, Malia, and Zakros are grand enough to deserve the word, yet they do not behave exactly like palaces in the familiar sense. They are administrative centres, ceremonial stages, storage systems, workshops, and symbols of authority all at once. They are built not simply to house power, but to organise it, display it, hide it, and make it feel woven into the rhythms of the island. Knossos is the most famous, partly because it is large, partly because later myth attaches itself to the site, and partly because modern excavation gave it a dramatic second life. Its corridors, courts, stairways, storerooms, painted rooms, and reconstructed colours have shaped the world's imagination of the Minoans more than any other place. Yet Knossos is not alone. Phaistos rises in south-central Crete, overlooking the Messara plain, with broad courts and elegant terraces. Malia sits near the northern coast, tied to fertile territory and maritime access. Zakros stands in the east, smaller but astonishing in its position near routes toward the Levant and Egypt. Each centre has its own character, but they share a language of architecture central courts, magazines filled with huge storage jars, ritual spaces, staircases, light wells, workrooms, and carefully managed movement through the building. These places take shape in the early 2nd millennium BC. Though their roots reach deeper into earlier Cretan communities, the first palace period is not a sudden miracle. It grows from long developments in farming, craft production, exchange, local leadership, and ritual authority. Then destruction comes, likely through earthquake or a combination of violent events, and the palaces are rebuilt on a more impressive scale. This pattern matters. Minoan civilization is not fragile in the simple sense. It knows damage, then answers with rebuilding. The later palaces are larger, more complex, and in some ways more theatrical. Their storerooms hold agricultural wealth. Their walls and thresholds guide people into sequences of approach, waiting, procession, and revelation. Power here may depend as much on choreography as command. One of the great surprises is what the palaces do not clearly show. They do not present obvious royal tombs filled with the bodies of named kings. They do not leave behind great victory inscriptions boasting of conquered enemies. Their art does not repeatedly place a monarch above kneeling subjects in the manner familiar from Egypt or Mesopotamia. There is a room at Knossos often called the throne room, with a stone seat set against the wall, flanked by painted griffins. But scholars still debate what kind of authority it represents. It may have served a ruler, a priestly figure, a ritual performer, or an institution whose details remain beyond reach. The evidence remains incomplete, and the language that might settle the question remains largely unread. This does not mean the Minoans have no hierarchy. The palaces themselves are proof of organised labour, planning, surplus, specialist craft, and social difference. Someone decides where grain, oil, wool, wine, metal, and finished goods are stored. Someone controls seals, tablets, measures, workshops, and access to inner spaces. Someone has the ability to mobilize builders, painters, potters, scribes, farmers, and sailors. Yet the structure of that authority is elusive. It may not match the king-centered model that modern minds expect. Power may have been shared among elite families, priestly lineages, administrators, local leaders, or palace institutions that changed over time. No single explanation fully accounts for the evidence. The Minoan palace is a machine of authority, but the face at its centre is blurred. The storage rooms reveal one layer of that machine. Long corridors at Knossos contain rows of great pithoi, enormous ceramic jars that could hold oil, grain, or other commodities. Their scale is almost bodily. A person standing beside them seems temporary, while the jars seem built for generations. Beneath some floors are stone-lined cists, perhaps used for storing valuable goods or ritual deposits. Earlier archaeologists sometimes interpreted circular pits near palace courts. The so-called couloirs as granaries, though their exact purpose remains debated. Even small uncertainties like this matter, because they remind us that every tidy reconstruction rests on fragments, soil stains, broken pottery, and architectural scars. Workshops add another layer. The palaces are not just places where wealth sits still, they are places where raw materials become objects of value. Stone vessels, seals, metalwork, textiles, pottery, carved ivory, and luxury goods move through skilled hands. The Minoan world depends on craft specialization, and the palaces seem to gather or supervise some of that production. Scribes record goods on clay tablets, not for literature or history as far as we can tell, but for administration. Many tablets survive only because fires baked them hard, turning temporary records into permanent clues by accident. It is a strange irony destruction preserves the paperwork of a society whose deeper voice still escapes us. The palaces also manage experience. Light falls through openings into interior spaces. Staircases create changes in level. Doorways multiply, open, close, and frame movement. Certain features once called lustral basins have been interpreted as ritual spaces, bathing areas, or symbolic sunken rooms. Scholars still debate their function. The architecture invites ceremony without fully explaining it. A person entering one of these centres in the Bronze Age may have encountered smells of oil, wool, incense, damp plaster, stored grain, and human crowding, along with flashes of painted walls and polished stone. The building is not silent. It works on the senses. This is why the phrase palaces without kings is useful. Even if imperfect, it captures the paradox at the heart of Minoan power. The palaces are monumental, but not blunt. They dominate their landscapes, but they do not announce domination in the expected visual language of warlike kingship. They accumulate wealth, but they also transform wealth into ritual and display. What survives in the record suggests a society where administration, religion, economy, and performance are tightly braided. Around these centres, fields are planted, workshops hum, roads and paths carry goods inward, and ceremonies bind people to institutions whose names are lost. Yet the same system that concentrates wealth can also concentrate risk. For now, though, the palace courts stand bright beneath the Cretan sun, and from their painted halls the island begins to move more confidently across the sea. From the palace courts, Crete's power does not remain fixed in stone. It moves outward, along roads that run through valleys and down to ports, then farther still across the shifting lanes of the Aegean. The Minoan world is a civilization of movement, and its confidence comes from knowing that the sea is not an edge but a passage. To people who live far inland, the horizon may look like a boundary. To the Minoans, it appears to be a route, a promise, and sometimes a threat disguised as open blue. Their island teaches them that wealth can arrive on the wind, that status can be carried in a jar, that ideas can travel inside a painted cup, and that a harbour can be as important as a throne. The ships themselves survive only indirectly. Wood rots, rigging vanishes, and Bronze Age hulls are rarely kind enough to remain whole for archaeologists. Yet Minoan ships appear in art, seals, models, and comparisons with later and neighbouring seafaring traditions. They are long, elegant vessels, powered by oars and sail, built for movement through island waters and beyond. Some images show high prows and sterns, cabins or raised structures, and careful attention to the shape of the hull. Scholars still debate the exact range, size, and organisation of Minoan fleets. but the broader pattern is clear enough. Crete does not become what it becomes without ships. The palace economy, the circulation of prestige goods, and the island's foreign contacts all depend on maritime skill. Ports and coastal settlements are therefore not simple appendages to the palace world. They are its openings to the wider Bronze Age. Places such as Komos on the southern coast, Amnisos near Knossos, and Palikastro in the east connect inland centres to sea routes. Some harbours face toward the Cyclades and mainland Greece, others toward Egypt, Cyprus, and the Levant. This matters because no Bronze Age island can produce everything it desires. Copper must come from elsewhere in significant quantities, tin is even more elusive, and luxury materials such as ivory, gold, semi-precious stones, and exotic pigments speak of networks reaching far beyond Crete. A finely made object in a palace room may carry within it the labour of miners, sailors, merchants, translators, scribes, craftsmen, and officials scattered across many coasts. Minoan pottery is one of the clearest signs of this movement. Its styles change over time, from the lively patterns of Kamara's ware to later marine designs filled with octopuses, shells, rocks, and curling sea life. These vessels are more than containers. They are ambassadors in clay. When found abroad, they suggest trade, gift exchange, migration, imitation, or some combination of all these. The evidence does not always reveal whether a pot travelled with a merchant, a diplomat, a craftsman, a family, or a cargo of oil. Still, its presence shows that Cretan things were desirable, recognisable, and able to cross cultural borders. In a world without printed labels or modern branding, style itself becomes a language of prestige. What Crete sends outward is not only pottery, olive oil, wine, textiles, wool, worked metal, crafted stone vessels, perfumes, and decorated goods likely move through Minoan networks. Some products leave few traces because they are consumed, worn out, or carried in containers that break and scatter. Textiles, in particular, may have been central to palace production, though cloth rarely survives in the Cretan soil. The administrative tablets and loom weights hint at a world of spinning, weaving, dyeing, storing, and counting. A palace storeroom filled with jars may look impressive to modern visitors, but the missing fabrics may once have represented equal or greater wealth. Archaeology often preserves the heavy things and loses the soft ones, which means the surviving record can distort the true balance of value. In return, Crete receives foreign goods and foreign signals. Egyptian objects appear in Minoan contexts, while Minoan-style art appears in places connected to Egypt and the Levant. The famous paintings at Avaris in Egypt, with bull-leaping and Aegean-style imagery, have long raised questions about artists, diplomacy, and cultural display. Were Minoan painters working abroad? Were Egyptian elites adopting Aegean motifs for political reasons? Were these images part of a broader international language of power? No single explanation fully accounts for every detail, but the connection is difficult to ignore. Crete is not a remote island occasionally touched by outsiders. It belongs to an international Bronze Age conversation. Yet this movement should not be mistaken for a modern empire drawn in clean lines on a map. Older ideas imagined a Minoan sea empire ruling the Aegean through naval dominance, almost a prehistoric version of later maritime powers. That may contain a memory of real influence, but the evidence remains incomplete. Minoan cultural presence beyond Crete does not always equal political control. A settlement using Minoan pottery or art may be trading with Crete, imitating Crete, hosting Cretan craftspeople, or participating in shared elite tastes. Influence can be powerful without being imperial. The Minoans may have projected authority through trade, ritual prestige, marriage alliances, specialized knowledge, and control of desirable goods as much as through force. The surprising detail is that their maritime confidence may have shaped even how they imagine the world. Minoan art does not treat the sea as empty space. Dolphins leap across walls, octopuses curl around vessels as if the pot itself belongs underwater. Fish, shells, and marine rocks become patterns of beauty. The sea enters domestic rooms, ceremonial spaces, storage jars, and drinking vessels. This is not merely decoration. It suggests a culture deeply familiar with coastal life, tidal rhythms, and the living abundance of the water. At the same time, the sea is never fully tame. Every sailor knows that the same water that carries wealth can swallow a ship without leaving a name behind. This hidden danger grows more important as Minoan society becomes more connected. A small isolated village can suffer locally and survive locally. A complex maritime civilization depends on links. It needs safe harbours, functioning ships, predictable routes, trusted partners, stored surplus, and administrative coordination. Connection multiplies wealth, but it also multiplies vulnerability. If ports are damaged, fleets lost, trade routes interrupted, or confidence shaken, the effects travel inward toward the palace storerooms and outward toward the island world. The Minoans thrive because they master movement, but movement is never entirely under human control. For now, in the high age of Minoan Crete, the sea roads remain open. Ships leave with jars packed into holds. Sailors read winds by experience rather than instruments. Officials seal goods and count what returns. Foreign objects enter Cretan rooms, and Cretan styles appear in distant places. The island does not stand still, it pulses. Its palaces are not only buildings but hubs in a living network, and each voyage strengthens the impression that Crete belongs at the centre of the sea. Yet beneath that confidence lies a truth that no painted dolphin can soften. A civilization built on the sea must trust the sea, and the sea, in the Bronze Age as now, has no obligation to be kind. From the sea roads and storerooms, the Minoan world turns inward again, into rooms where walls seem to move. Paint survives in fragments, often broken, restored, disputed, and sometimes reconstructed more boldly than modern caution would prefer. Yet, even in pieces, it changes the atmosphere of the ruins. A hand holding saffron flowers, a blue monkey reaching through a rocky landscape, dolphins swimming above a room at Knossos, women with elaborate hair and bright garments, men carrying vessels in procession, griffins beside a ceremonial chair, the curve of a bull's back at the instant before danger becomes spectacle. These images make the Minoans feel unusually close. Other Bronze Age civilizations often speak through kings, laws, battles, and tombs. Minoan Crete often comes to us through colour, motion, and ritual, as if the island wished to be remembered not by rulers but by charged moments. The frescoes are not simple decoration, they belong to an architecture of experience. A person passing through a palace corridor or entering a ceremonial room may have been surrounded by painted surfaces that turned plaster into landscape, procession, sea, or sacred drama. The images would have caught lamplight and daylight differently through the day. Colours made from mineral pigments created a visual world that was not naturalistic in the modern sense, but intensely alive. Bodies are stylized. Landscapes are compressed. Animals are graceful and alert, and patterns often feel rhythmic rather than merely descriptive. What survives in the record suggests that seeing was part of participation. To walk through a Minoan palace was not simply to pass through administrative space. It was to enter a controlled world of symbols. The bull stands near the centre of that symbolic world. Bulls appear in art, seal stones, vessels, rita, figurines, and architectural motifs. The famous bull-leaping scenes show human figures vaulting over or near a charging animal, though scholars still debate whether these images record an actual sport, a ritual performance, an elite initiation, a symbolic myth, or a mixture of these possibilities. The act itself, if performed physically, would have been extremely dangerous. A real bull is not a decorative creature. It is muscle, speed, bone, horn, heat, and unpredictability. The Minoan fascination with bulls may have drawn power from that danger. To approach the animal, to master the timing of its movement, or even to represent such mastery, was to turn risk into ceremony. The so-called horns of consecration, stone or plaster forms resembling upward curving horns, appear at palaces and sacred places, reinforcing the connection between bull imagery and ritual authority. Double axes, often called lebris, also appear in Minoan religious contexts, though their meaning remains debated and should not be reduced to a single simple symbol. Later Greek imagination would connect Crete with the Minotaur, the labyrinth, and King Minos. But those myths are centuries younger than the height of Minoan civilization. It is tempting to read them backward into the Bronze Age, as if every bull image were already whispering about a monster beneath Knossos. That temptation must be handled carefully. The myths may preserve distorted memories, but they're not straightforward records. The evidence remains incomplete, and the Minoan bull belongs first to Minoan ritual, not to later Greek storytelling. Women appear prominently in Minoan imagery, sometimes with elaborate garments, exposed breasts in ceremonial dress, carefully arranged hair, and gestures that suggest participation in ritual or elite display. This has led to many interpretations, from priestesses and goddesses to courtly women, attendants, dancers, or symbolic figures. Earlier writers sometimes imagined Minoan Crete as a goddess-centered, peaceful society, but that picture often says as much about modern longing as ancient reality. Still, the prominence of female figures is striking. They are not hidden in the margins. They stand in processions, occupy sacred scenes, handle offerings, and appear in positions of visual importance. What that means for actual social power is harder to know. Art can magnify ideals that daily life does not fully share. Yet it would be equally careless to ignore the evidence. Ritual does not belong only inside the palaces. The island's sacred geography stretches upward and downward, toward peaks and caves, at peak sanctuaries. Worshippers leave clay figurines of humans, animals, body parts, and votive objects. Some figurines raise their arms in gestures that may signal prayer, epiphany, or ritual presence. In caves, offerings are placed in shadowed interiors where water, stone, darkness, and echo would have shaped the experience. The Minoan sacred world is therefore not confined to built temples. It moves between palace courts, mountain ridges, rural shrines, caves, springs, trees, and perhaps open-air ceremonies. Nature is not just background, it is part of the ritual system. One lesser-known and haunting detail is the appearance of small votive body parts at some sanctuary sites, clay limbs, torsos, or other anatomical forms offered perhaps for healing, protection, or symbolic dedication. They remind us that behind the elegance of palace frescoes were ordinary human fears. A parent may have worried over a child's fever. A farmer may have feared injury, drought, or failed animals. A woman may have prayed for fertility, safe birth, or recovery. A sailor may have given thanks after surviving a storm. The polished museum image of Minoan art can make the civilization seem almost weightless. But the offerings bring back the pressure of real bodies living with pain, hope, and uncertainty. The frescoes and rituals also reveal how Minoan society may have bound communities together. Large courts could host gatherings, performances, processions, feasts, or ceremonies where people saw power enacted rather than merely announced. Storage and redistribution might feed such events. Imported luxuries might intensify them. Costumes, vessels, music, dance, animal symbolism, and carefully framed movement through palace spaces could turn political authority into sacred experience. No single explanation fully accounts for the palaces, but ritual seems inseparable from their function. The Minoan elite, whoever they were, did not rely only on counting jars, they staged a world. And yet the spectacle is fragile. Fresco plaster cracks, pigments fade, ritual objects break, sacred caves become archaeological sites, bulls vanish from the courts, leaving only painted outlines and stone horns under the sun. The same walls that once surrounded living ceremonies now survive as fragments, and each fragment carries both revelation and silence. Through them, the Minoans appear as a people devoted to movement, colour, performance, and sacred power. But their most vivid images still do not tell us exactly what was spoken, sung, feared, promised, or believed. The walls are alive, yet the language behind them remains distant, waiting in signs that will soon lead the story into one of the deepest frustrations of Minoan history. Behind the painted walls and sacred gestures are hands that grind grain, twist wool, shape clay, carry water, seal jars, sweep courtyards, prune vines, tend animals, mend nets, and lift children onto shaded thresholds while the heat gathers over the island. The Minoan world is often remembered through palaces, bulls, frescoes, and the mystery of its unread script, but no civilization is made only from ceremonies. It is made from repeated labour, from the quiet tasks that leave fewer dramatic traces than a collapsed wall or a volcanic ash layer. The people who keep Crete alive are not always visible in the grand images, yet they are everywhere in the archaeological record, hidden in loom weights, cooking pots, storage jars, worn thresholds, animal bones, charred seeds, drains, tools, and the floors of ordinary rooms. Daily life on Minoan Crete varies sharply depending on place and status. A person living near Knossos may feel the pull of palace administration, ritual gatherings, craft production, and imported goods. Someone in a smaller village may live closer to the cycle of fields, flocks, local shrines, and seasonal exchange. A harbour community hears more foreign accents, sees more ships, and handles more goods from abroad. A mountain settlement lives with different winds and different risks. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests a society of many connected worlds rather than one uniform palace culture spread evenly over the island. Minoan identity may have been shared through styles, rituals, goods, and administration. Yet lived experience was shaped by valley, coast, class, occupation, and household. Food begins with the land, grain, olives, grapes, legumes, figs, and other crops support the island's economy, while sheep, goats, cattle, and pigs provide meat, milk, wool, hides, labour, and status in different measures. Fish and shellfish matter in coastal areas, though the sea's symbolic presence in Minoan art should not make us imagine every table overflowing with seafood. Most meals are probably modest, built from cereals, pulses, oil, fruit, herbs, and occasional meat. Storage is essential. The great pythoi in palaces impress the eye, but households also store what they need in smaller jars and bins. A bad season is not a poetic inconvenience, it is a direct threat. The Minoan achievement rests partly on the ability to gather, preserve, measure, and redistribute food in a landscape that can be generous but never entirely predictable. One surprising detail is how much attention the Minoans give to water management. At several palace and town sites, archaeologists have found drains, channels, terracotta pipes, settling basins, and systems for moving rainwater and wastewater. Knossos is especially famous for these features, though modern descriptions sometimes exaggerate them into something too close to modern plumbing. Still, the skill is real. In a crowded complex where people work, store food, perform rituals, and gather in numbers, water must be controlled. A drain is not glamorous like a fresco, but it reveals a practical intelligence just as important as art. Civilizations survive not only by imagining gods and building monuments, but by keeping dirty water away from living spaces. Craft production fills another layer of daily life. Potters shape vessels for storage, cooking, serving, ritual and trade. Stoneworkers carve vessels and seals from hard materials with extraordinary patience. Metalworkers cast, hammer, sharpen, and repair tools, weapons, ornaments, and fittings. Seal engravers create tiny images that can carry identity, authority, and beauty in the space of a thumbprint. Textile workers spin and weave in quantities that may have formed a major part of the economy. Because cloth decays, the textile world is easy to underestimate. Loom weights, spindle whirls, administrative records from later contexts, and workshop spaces suggest that weaving is not merely domestic background noise. It is industry, skill, wealth, and perhaps palace control. Women appear here again, but now less as painted ritual figures and more as likely participants in labour, household management, textile production, and ceremonial life. Minoan art gives women an unusual visual prominence, yet archaeology cannot easily convert that prominence into a simple statement about equality or rule. Scholars still debate how gender worked in a Minoan society. Some women may have held ritual authority. Elite women may have played visible roles in ceremony and display. Many others likely worked intensely in homes, fields, workshops, and storage systems. The challenge is to avoid both extremes, imagining Minoan Crete as a lost paradise of female power, or dismissing the art as meaningless decoration. What survives in the record suggests importance, but the nature of that importance remains difficult to measure. Clothing itself speaks of labour and identity. The elaborate garments shown in frescoes, with flounced skirts, fitted bodices, patterned textiles, jewellery, and carefully arranged hair, are not everyday wear for everyone. They likely belong to elite, ceremonial, or symbolic contexts. Yet their complexity points to skilled textile production and a society that understands clothing as social language. Colour, fabric, cut, ornament, and hairstyle can communicate age, role, status, ritual function, or group identity. Even if the painted scenes idealize reality, they preserve a world in which appearance matters deeply. A procession is not only people walking, it is cloth, gesture, order, and meaning moving together. Homes outside the palaces could be surprisingly sophisticated. At sites such as Akrotiri on Thera, closely connected to the Minoan world, multi-story houses, painted interiors, storage rooms, stairways, and urban planning reveal an Aegean society with comfort and complexity beyond royal centres. On Crete itself, towns and villas show that wealth and administration are not limited to the main palaces. Some buildings called villas may have served as local elite residences, agricultural centres, ritual places, or administrative nodes. No single explanation fits all of them. They show, however, that the palace system reaches outward through smaller centres, linking countryside and court. The people inside these systems are not abstractions. They wake before heat becomes oppressive. They smell smoke, oil, wool, crushed herbs, damp clay, animals, wine, and the sea wind moving through alleys. They hear grinding stones, footsteps on plastered floors, tools tapping, jars being dragged, animals calling, and voices in a language still mostly lost. They live with beauty, but also with disease, injury, childbirth danger, crop anxiety, storms, earthquakes, and social obligations. The Minoan world may appear graceful in museum fragments, yet it is built on work that is repetitive, physical, and often invisible. This invisible life matters because it is what catastrophe eventually threatens. A palace can burn, but so can a storeroom of grain. A harbour can be damaged, but so can the household that depends on goods arriving there. A ritual system can be shaken, but so can the confidence of the people who bring offerings to a cracked shrine. Before the great natural disaster enters the story more fully, Crete is already a living society of unequal burdens and shared rhythms. The frescoes show the world the Minoans want to stage. The workshops, kitchens, drains, fields, and homes reveal the world that makes the staging possible. And somewhere between those two worlds, the civilization leaves the small clay signs of administration, marks meant for practical eyes, marks that now stand as one of the greatest barriers between modern observers and the Minoan mind. The clay signs begin as practical marks, made not for mystery but for work. A scribe presses a stylus into a damp tablet, recording goods, quantities, names, places, offerings, animals, textiles, vessels, oil, grain, or whatever the palace needs to count before the clay dries and the record becomes useless. These are not grand inscriptions carved for eternity. They are administrative tools, temporary notes in the machinery of storage and redistribution, yet by accident. Through fire and destruction, some of them survive. Flames bake the clay hard. A record meant to last perhaps a season becomes a message lasting more than 3,000 years. And still, for the most part, the message does not open. This is one of the deepest frustrations of Minoan history. The civilization leaves writing, but not writing modern scholars can fully read. Crete preserves several systems of signs across the Bronze Age, including Cretan hieroglyphic and Linear A, followed later by Linear B. Linear B can be read, and its decipherment in the 20th century revealed an early form of Greek used in Mycenaean administration, but Linear B belongs mainly to the later phase of palace life on Crete. After Mycenaean influence has become strong, Linear A, the script most closely associated with the Minoan language, remains undeciphered in any secure, comprehensive way. Individual signs can sometimes be assigned sound values by comparison with Linear B, but knowing the possible sound of a sign does not mean knowing the language behind it. It is like hearing a voice through a wall, clear enough to know someone is speaking, too muffled to understand the meaning. The signs of Linear A are elegant, economical, and maddening. They appear on tablets, ceilings, roundels, vessels, and other objects. Many surviving examples are administrative, which means even a perfect decipherment might not immediately give us myths, poems, royal biographies, or philosophical reflections. We might first receive lists, quantities, commodities, transactions, names, places, but even that would change the field. A readable account tablet can reveal social structure, economic priorities, place names, offices, offerings, and systems of control. It can show what the palace cared enough to count. In ancient societies, bureaucracy is never just paperwork, it is power made into marks. Cretan hieroglyphic, used earlier and partly overlapping with Linear A, adds another layer to the problem. Its signs appear on seals, ceilings, and some other objects, and the term hieroglyphic is a modern label, not a claim that it works like Egyptian writing. Some signs look pictorial, others more abstract, and scholars still debate many details of its relationship to Linear A and the administrative systems around it. Was it an independent script A related system? A specialized form used in certain contexts, the evidence remains incomplete. The surviving corpus is not large enough to make the problem easy, and many inscriptions are short, exactly the kind that frustrate decipherment. Then there is the famous Phaistos disc, one of the most intriguing and controversial objects from Bronze Age Crete. It is a round clay disc stamped with a spiral of signs on both sides, found at Phaistos in the early 20th century. The signs were impressed with stamps, making it unlike most other known Aegean writing of its time. Its meaning is unknown, its function debated, and its uniqueness makes it almost impossible to decipher by normal methods. Popular imagination has turned it into everything from a hymn to a calendar to a coded message, but responsible scholarship remains cautious. A single, unusual object, without many parallel texts, cannot carry confident translation. It is a perfect emblem of the Minoan problem, a thing that looks meaningful, carefully made, almost ready to speak, yet standing at the edge of silence. Writing also reminds us that Minoan Crete is not merely artistic and ritualistic, it is administrative. Goods are sealed, tracked, moved, and accounted for. Clay ceilings preserve impressions from carved seals, linking objects, people, or institutions to controlled exchanges. A jar sealed at one point may be opened at another. A storage room may contain goods not simply piled at random but measured and registered. The palace world depends on trust, control, identity, and verification. In a society without modern paper, printing, or digital records, a clay, string, seal, and mark become the instruments of organization. Every small tablet is part of a larger structure of authority. The lesser-known detail is that many of these records survive not because the Minoans wanted to preserve them, but because disaster interrupted their ordinary life. Clay tablets, if left unbaked, can crumble or be reused. A palace archive is not necessarily a library. It may be a working office full of temporary records. When fire destroys the building, it accidentally fires the clay. This means the archaeological record may privilege moments of crisis. We read, or try to read, the paperwork that happened to be present when something burned. The surviving archive is not a calm, complete mirror of Minoan society. It is a snapshot taken by catastrophe. The unread scripts shape every question about Minoan rule, religion, and identity. Did the palaces answer to kings, priestly authorities, councils, elite households, or shifting regional powers? What names did they use for their gods? What did they call Crete, Knossos, or the sea routes beyond the island? How did they describe offerings, labour obligations, land, trade, and status? Without full access to their written language, scholars must lean heavily on architecture, art, material culture, burial customs, settlement patterns, and comparison with neighbouring societies. These sources are powerful, but they are indirect. A fresco can show a procession. It cannot easily explain the office of the person leading it. A storeroom can show surplus. It cannot reveal who had the final right to command it. A seal can show control. It cannot always name the controller. This silence has consequences for the story of collapse as well. When Egypt faces crisis, inscriptions sometimes boast, mourn, exaggerate, or reinterpret events. When Mesopotamian cities suffer defeat or famine, texts may preserve echoes of administrative strain or royal anxiety. For the Minoans, the most crucial centuries remain largely wordless. If people on Crete recorded the eruption of Thera, crop failures, harbour damage, foreign pressure, political rivalry, or religious fear in Linear A, those records have not yet become readable testimony. The disaster is therefore reconstructed from ash, destruction layers, pottery sequences, environmental data, and later changes in material culture, not from Minoan voices telling us what they believed had happened. And so the civilization becomes both vivid and veiled. Its walls show colour, its roads carry goods, its palaces organise labour, its seals mark authority, its ships cross the sea, its hands press signs into clay. But the central language remains closed, and the closer one looks, the more painful that closure becomes. The Minoans are not silent because they had nothing to say. They are silent because the key has not been found. On the eve of the great rupture, their world is wealthy, connected, ceremonial, and administered with care. It is also dangerously dependent on systems whose inner logic modern eyes can only partly see. The signs remain in the clay, waiting, while beyond Crete the volcanic island to the north gathers pressure beneath its beautiful ring of land and sea. Before the sky breaks over the Aegean, Crete appears to stand at the height of its confidence. The palace centres are active, the workshops busy, the storerooms full enough to require careful counting, and the sea routes familiar enough that distant places no longer feel unreachable. Ships move between harbours with cargoes that tie the island to the Cyclades, mainland Greece, Egypt, Anatolia, Cyprus, and the Levant. In palace rooms, scribes press signs into clay. In courtyards, ceremonies gather bodies into order. In workshops, raw materials become finished objects whose beauty hides the long chain of labour behind them. The Minoan world is not frozen in an age of innocence before disaster. It is complex, ambitious, adaptable, and already carrying pressures that are difficult to see until something violent exposes them. Late Bronze Age Crete is a society of surfaces and systems. On the surface, there is colour, movement, confidence, and display. Frescoes brighten walls, fine pottery circulates, elite spaces create carefully staged experiences of power. The sea appears in art not as a boundary but as a living companion. Beneath that surface, however, are systems that must keep working: agricultural production, storage, redistribution, craft organisation, local authority, ritual obligation, maritime exchange, and the trust that allows goods and people to move. A palace society depends not only on wealth but on rhythm. Harvests must arrive, jars must be filled, ships must return, officials must count accurately, craftspeople must be supplied, ceremonies must be performed. If too many rhythms fail at once, the brilliance above them begins to tremble. The years before the Theran eruption are difficult to reconstruct with precision because the evidence is scattered and chronology remains debated in important details. Archaeologists can identify phases of pottery, destruction layers, rebuilding episodes, and imported objects. But turning these into exact human years is never simple. Radiocarbon evidence and archaeological dating have not always aligned neatly, especially around the date of the eruption. Scholars still debate whether the eruption occurred earlier than traditional archaeological chronology once allowed, and that debate affects how closely it can be tied to specific events on Crete. This uncertainty matters. If the eruption predates certain destructions by decades or more, then it cannot be treated as a direct single cause of every later collapse. If its effects lingered through economic, environmental, or social disruption, then its shadow may still be long even without immediate destruction everywhere. Crete itself, at this point, is not a single palace under a single obvious ruler. Knossos is powerful, perhaps preeminent, but other centres matter: Phaistos, Malea, Zakros, and smaller sites form a network of authority, production, and ritual life. The balance between cooperation and rivalry is hard to know. The palaces share cultural forms, yet they also occupy different regions with their own interests. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is possible that Minoan Crete contained competing elites whose relationships shifted over time. A connected island can look unified from a distance while containing tensions up close. The smooth plaster of a palace wall does not reveal the negotiations behind it. There are signs of strength everywhere. Large storage facilities suggest the capacity to gather surplus. Fine craft goods reveal trained specialists. Imported materials show continuing access to long-distance exchange. The spread of Minoan styles across the Aegean suggest cultural prestige. Settlements tied to Crete or deeply influenced by it appear in other islands, and Akrotiri on Thera itself offers a remarkable glimpse of an Aegean town with strong Minoan connections. Its multi-story houses, frescoes, drainage systems, storage vessels, and organised streets show how far the cultural world of Crete may have extended beyond the island. Yet Akrotiri also sits directly on the volcano that will soon erupt, the very outpost that reveals the sophistication of Minoan-connected life becomes a buried witness to its vulnerability. The people of Crete may have known earthquakes well. The Aegean is a restless region, and Minoan buildings show histories of damage and repair. Earthquakes can crack walls, shift foundations, damage storage rooms, and frighten communities into ritual response. Rebuilding after such events may have been part of Minoan experience for generations. This matters because familiarity with disaster can create resilience, but it can also normalize danger. If tremors shook the island before the eruption, people may have repaired, waited, offered, and continued. What survives in the record suggests that destruction and renewal were not strangers to Minoan society. But not every disaster belongs to the same scale. Some shocks can be absorbed, others arrive as part of a chain. A lesser-known detail in the pre-eruption story is the warning preserved at Akrotiri. The town appears to have been damaged by earthquakes before the final volcanic burial, and there are signs that people return to clear debris or retrieve belongings before abandoning the site. No human bodies have been found in the buried town, unlike Pompeii many centuries later. This absence does not mean the eruption was harmless. It suggests that people had enough warning to flee, or that the final phase came after evacuation. The silence of Akrotiri is therefore not the silence of people caught unaware in their homes. It is the silence of a town emptied before the sky fell, its possessions left behind in a strange pause between survival and loss. On Crete, the warning may have been less direct. People may have seen unusual skies, felt earthquakes, heard reports from sailors, or encountered floating pumice after the eruption. But there is no readable Minoan account telling us what they noticed or feared. Imagine a harbour official watching debris arrive from the north. Imagine sailors returning with stories of an island changed beyond recognition. Imagine priests or ritual specialists interpreting tremors, darkness, or strange sea behaviour through sacred frameworks now lost. These scenes are inferred, not known, but they are grounded in the human reality of catastrophe. People do not experience geological events as scientific data. They experience them as omens, shortages, broken routes, damaged places, and decisions that must be made before full understanding is possible. The great vulnerability of Minoan Crete lies in its success. The island has become wealthy because it is connected. But connection turns distant disaster into local consequence. A volcanic eruption on Thera is not merely a geological event for Thera, if Cretan ships use those waters, if trade passes through those islands, if coastal settlements depend on harbours exposed to waves, if political legitimacy depends on ceremonies that must continue in damaged palaces, and if elites rely on goods that can no longer move with confidence. The more sophisticated the system, the more ways it can be wounded. So Crete stands before the rupture like a brightly painted vessel on a shelf, beautiful, useful, carefully made, and more breakable than it appears. Nothing in the palace frescoes announces the exact hour of danger. The bulls still leap, the dolphins still swim across plaster seas, the jars still stand in their rows, but to the north, under an island of white houses not yet built and cliffs not yet shaped into their modern form, pressure gathers beneath the earth. The Minoans have mastered many movements of sea and land. They have not mastered the fire below the Aegean. When Thera erupts, the Aegean does not simply witness a mountain exploding, it witnesses a landscape unmaking itself. The island that modern eyes know as Santorini is, in the Bronze Age, a volcanic place already shaped by earlier fire, a curved and dangerous land rising from the sea north of Crete. Its beauty is not gentle. Beneath its slopes, magma has been gathering pressure in silence, and the people living at Crete have already felt warnings in the ground. Walls crack. Buildings suffer earthquake damage. Streets fill with debris. Some inhabitants return long enough to clear passages or retrieve valuables. Then, at some point, the final abandonment comes. Houses remain filled with jars, furniture impressions, painted walls, tools, and traces of ordinary life interrupted, but not with bodies. The town becomes a place people leave before the worst arrives. The eruption itself unfolds in stages, and those stages matter because catastrophe is rarely a single instant. First comes the violence of ash and pumice, thrown upward and outward, spreading over the island and across the sea. The sky darkens. Air fills with particles sharp enough to choke breath and strip leaves. Pumice falls so thickly that roofs, courtyards, rooms, and streets vanish beneath pale volcanic stone. Then the eruption grows more violent, sending towering columns into the atmosphere. At some stage, the volcanic system collapses inward, helping form the great caldera that defines Santorini today. Sea rushes, steam explodes, and the island's shape is transformed. What had been a living settlement becomes a sealed chamber beneath volcanic deposits. For anyone close enough to see it from the sea, the eruption must have seemed like the world changing its rules. A column of ash rising tens of kilometres into the sky would have been visible across great distances, depending on weather and direction. Lightning may have flickered inside the ash cloud. Daylight may have dimmed. The sea around Thera may have filled with floating pumice, turning familiar routes into strange fields of pale stone. Sailors could have found water where oars struck not clean waves but drifting volcanic debris. The evidence remains incomplete, but the physical reality is clear. This was not an event easily ignored by the maritime world around it. The exact date of the eruption remains one of the most debated problems in Aegean archaeology. Scientific dating methods, including radiocarbon evidence, have often pointed to an earlier date in the 17th century BC, while traditional archaeological links with Egyptian chronology once placed it later, closer to the 16th century BC. The debate is not a small technical quarrel. It affects how the eruption fits into the history of Minoan Crete. If it happened significantly earlier than some major destructions on Crete, then it cannot be treated as the immediate cause of all of them. If it happened closer to certain disruptions, then its role may appear more direct. Scholars still debate the details, and no single chronological model fully removes the tension. The volcano leaves ash, but not a calendar. What can be said with more confidence is that the eruption was enormous. It was one of the great volcanic events of the Bronze Age Mediterranean, powerful enough to bury Akrotiri and spread Tifra across a wide area. Volcanic material from Thera has been identified in marine cores and regional deposits, allowing scientists to trace its reach. The eruption likely affected atmosphere, sea, and coast, though the intensity of those effects varied by location. It is easy to imagine the whole eastern Mediterranean plunged into instant ruin, but that is too simple. Large eruptions can create dramatic regional consequences without producing uniform devastation everywhere. Ashfall, climate disturbance, tsunamis, disrupted sailing, fear, and economic shock may all matter, but each must be weighed carefully. Ash is one of the most visible agents of the eruption, yet its impact on Crete is complicated. Heavy ash can destroy crops, contaminate water, injure animals, collapse roofs, and make breathing difficult. But the heaviest deposits fall closest to the volcano, and wind direction determines where ash travels most severely. Some parts of Crete may have received ashfall, others may have experienced less direct impact. The popular image of Crete buried under volcanic ash like Akrotiri is not supported. Crete was not entombed. Its palaces did not disappear under meters of pumice. The danger was subtler and perhaps, for that reason, more historically interesting. Damage did not need to be total to be destabilizing. A maritime civilization could suffer from interrupted routes, damaged ports, frightened sailors, failed harvests in vulnerable zones, and the psychological shock of seeing a sacred and familiar world ruptured. Then there is the sea, when a volcanic island collapses, displaces water, or sends pyroclastic flows into the ocean. Tsunamis can form. For Crete, lying to the south, this possibility has long been central to the story. Waves generated by the Theran eruption may have travelled across the Aegean toward northern Cretan coasts. The scale, timing, and local impact of these waves remain debated, but tsunami deposits at some coastal sites have kept the question alive. A tsunami does not need to erase an entire island to change history. It can smash boats, damage harbour installations, ruin coastal storage, drown fields near shore, scatter debris inland, and frighten communities away from exposed places. For a civilization whose confidence depends on the sea turning suddenly violent carries more than physical force. It attacks trust. The eruption may also have created climate effects, though these too remain difficult to measure. Volcanic aerosols can cool temperatures and disturb rainfall patterns, but the severity and duration depend on the eruption's chemistry, height, sulfur output, and atmospheric circulation. Ancient people would not describe such effects in scientific terms. They would notice odd weather, poor harvests, dim skies, hunger, or disease if those followed. But connecting every later hardship directly to Thera would go beyond the evidence. What survives in the record suggests a powerful environmental shock, not a simple, universal apocalypse. A lesser-known part of the eruption story is how much it preserves, not only how much it destroys. Akrotiri, sealed beneath volcanic deposits, gives modern archaeology one of its richest Bronze Age windows. Its frescoes show ships, towns, landscapes, animals, women gathering saffron, and complex urban life. Its houses preserve storage jars, staircases, wall paintings, and hints of social organization. The eruption kills the town as a living place, but protects it from later disturbance. Catastrophe becomes an archivist, yet the archive is cruelly selective. It preserves walls and jars, not the full journeys of the people who escaped, where they went, what they carried, or whether they ever saw their home again. For Crete, the eruption is both event and question. Did it shatter Minoan sea power at once, or did it begin a chain of disruptions whose effects unfolded over generations? Did waves destroy fleets and harbours, or were the greatest consequences economic and symbolic? Did elites lose legitimacy when rituals failed to protect the world? Or did palaces use catastrophe to intensify control? The evidence does not answer cleanly. But the eruption changes the frame. After Thera, the Minoan world can no longer be imagined as untouched confidence beneath a bright Aegean sky. Fire has entered the sea. A connected world has learned that disaster can travel, and somewhere along the northern coast of Crete, people may soon walk among broken boats, strange deposits, and shorelines rearranged by waves that began with a mountain tearing itself apart. The wave leaves no inscription. It does not carve its name into a palace wall or leave behind a tablet explaining where it began. It arrives as force, then withdraws, and what remains is a disorder that later archaeologists must learn to read strange layers of sand. Broken shells carried inland, marine organisms where they do not belong, stones shifted from shorelines, shattered pottery mixed with debris, and coastal deposits that seem to speak of the sea crossing a boundary it normally respects. On northern Crete, where harbours look toward Thera and the island chain beyond, the possibility of tsunami damage becomes one of the most compelling clues in the mystery of Minoan decline. The sea that made Crete powerful may have turned against the very places that connected it to the world. A tsunami is not like an ordinary storm wave, even a violent one. It is a movement of water created by displacement, travelling across the sea with deep energy that may remain almost invisible in open water before rising dangerously near shore. To those on land, it can appear first as something wrong: the water withdrawing, boats settling oddly, fish exposed, people stepping forward in confusion before the sea returns with impossible speed. Whether anyone on Bronze Age Crete saw such signs and understood them, no one can say. The evidence remains incomplete. But if tsunami waves from the Theran eruption reached Cretan coasts with force, they would have struck not an empty wilderness, but a maritime society whose harbours, ships, warehouses, coastal roads, and fishing communities formed the living edge of its economy. The northern coast is especially important because it faces the direction of Thera. Sites connected to Minoan life along this coast have produced evidence that some scholars interpret as tsunami-related. At places such as Palekastro in eastern Crete, deposits have been studied for signs of marine inundation linked to the eruption. The details remain debated, as they often do with ancient tsunami evidence. Storms can also move marine material. Later disturbance can confuse layers. Dating is difficult. A deposit may reveal a violent marine event without proving exactly how large it was or how far its consequences reached. Still, the pattern is strong enough that the question cannot be dismissed. Something about the sea's violence seems to have entered the archaeological record. The damage from such waves would not need to reach the great inland palace. Rooms directly to matter. Knossos itself is not sitting exposed at the water's edge, waiting to be swept away. But Knossos depends on coastal access through ports such as Amnisos. A palace centre inland can survive while its maritime arteries are injured. Ships can be broken, cargoes can be lost, docking areas can be choked with debris, storehouses near shore can be flooded, fishing boats, merchant vessels, and small craft can vanish in a single hour. Coastal fields may be salted or covered with sand, wells can be contaminated, people who live by the water can be killed, displaced, or frightened into abandoning vulnerable ground. In a connected society, the wound travels inward even if the wave does not. This is one reason the image of a tsunami smashing directly through all Minoan palaces is too simple. The more plausible danger is systemic. Ports are not glamorous ruins in the way palaces are, but they are essential. A palace storeroom full of jars has meaning because goods can enter and leave through routes that work. Oil, wine, Textiles, metals, stone, timber, and luxury materials depend on movement. If the sea lanes are disrupted after the eruption, if ships are lost, if sailors fear certain routes, if island partners are destroyed or displaced, then the palace economy begins to feel pressure. It may still function, it may even appear impressive for a time, but its confidence has been struck at the edge. There is also the psychological blow. The Minoans live with a sacred landscape in which mountains, caves, animals, trees, and perhaps the sea itself carry ritual force. A tsunami is not merely a natural hazard to people without modern geology. It is an event demanding interpretation. A harbour that had always been a place of departure and return becomes a place of bodies, wreckage, and offerings. A shoreline that once promised connection now shows that the sea can cross into human space without permission. Ritual specialists may have responded with ceremonies. Elites may have tried to restore order through rebuilding and display. Families may have carried grief into shrines whose meanings are now lost. What survives in the record suggests disturbance, but not the prayers spoken over it. One lesser-known consequence of tsunami damage is that it can erase evidence of itself while creating new evidence in confusing ways. Water surges in, tears apart structures, carries objects inland, then drags other material back out. Later, rebuilding clears debris. Later storms rework deposits. People salvage usable stone, timber, and goods. Archaeologists arrive thousands of years later and must distinguish tsunami from storm, human dumping, erosion, earthquake collapse, an ordinary coastal change. This is why responsible interpretations remain careful. The absence of dramatic destruction at every coastal site does not mean no tsunami occurred. The presence of marine deposits does not automatically prove a single catastrophic wave from Thera. The truth must be pieced together from many small signs. If ports suffer, sea power suffers in a way that can be difficult to see from palace architecture alone. A fleet is not only ships, it is crews, boatyards, timber supplies, rope, sails, navigational knowledge, harbour facilities, storage areas, political agreements, and confidence that voyagers will repay the risk, destroy enough of that, or even interrupt it at the wrong moment, and a maritime civilization can become less able to project influence. Rivals may notice. Local elites may become more independent. Foreign partners may turn elsewhere. Mycenaean communities on the mainland, already growing in wealth and ambition, may find opportunities in the weakening of Minoan networks. This does not require a sudden invasion in the smoke of the eruption. It requires only a shift in balance. Still, Crete is not helpless. The Minoans have known earthquakes, repairs, and rebuilding before. Coastal communities can move, harbours can be cleared, ships can be replaced if enough people, timber, and organisation remain. The palaces may absorb the shock, redistribute stored goods, sponsor rebuilding, and perform rituals of restoration. This resilience is part of why the decline cannot be reduced to a single wave. A tsunami may wound the system without killing it outright. The sea may damage the edges, while the palace centres continue to shine inland for years, perhaps decades, perhaps longer depending on the chronology one accepts. The most haunting possibility is that the wave creates a before and after that the people themselves feel more clearly than archaeology can prove. Before, the sea is the road that makes Crete central. After, it is still a road, but one marked by memory. Sailors pass floating pumice. Coastal families rebuild with eyes turned uneasily toward the horizon. Palace officials count what remains and what fails to arrive. Priests or priestesses stand before sacred symbols and attempt to bind a shaken world back together. The fresco dolphins still swim on palace walls. But outside those walls, the real sea has shown another face. The Minoan world is not ended yet. It is damaged, unsettled, and forced to continue with a new knowledge of its own vulnerability. The most misleading image of the Minoan collapse is the easiest one to imagine. A volcano erupts, a wave strikes, palaces burn, and an advanced island civilization vanishes under the weight of nature. It is clean, dramatic, and memorable. It is also too simple. The Minoan world does not end like a lamp being blown out. It flickers, steadies, changes colour, burns in some places while dimming in others, and only gradually becomes something that no longer looks like the civilization that once filled Crete with palace courts, painted rituals, busy workshops, and ships moving confidently through the Aegean. Collapse, in this case, is not a single moment. It is a long loss of balance. This matters because the archaeological record refuses to behave like a disaster tale with one clear ending. Some places are destroyed, others continue. Some buildings are rebuilt, some traditions survive, some regions seem more affected than others. Knossos remains important after the Theran eruption, and that fact alone complicates any simple story of instant destruction. If Thera had wiped out Minoan civilization in one blow, the later evidence from Crete would look very different. Instead, what survives in the record suggests a society absorbing shock, reorganizing, and continuing for a time under growing strain. The catastrophe may have been real and severe, but it did not immediately erase the island's people, skills, memory, or institutions. The palaces themselves carry this uneven story in their walls. Destruction layers appear at different sites and in different phases, and the interpretation of those layers is never automatic. Fire can mean attack, accident, earthquake damage followed by burning, internal conflict, abandonment, ritual closure, or later disturbance. A collapsed wall can speak of an earthquake, poor maintenance, rebuilding, or human violence. Pottery styles help date events, but dating is rarely precise enough to turn ruins into a simple calendar. Scholars still debate how various destructions relate to the eruption, later political changes, and the arrival or rise of Mycenaean influence. The evidence remains incomplete, and every layer must be read against many other layers. What becomes clearer is that Minoan society after Thera faces a changed environment of risk. Even if ashfall does not bury Crete, and even if tsunamis do not destroy every harbour, the eruption can still weaken the systems that made the island powerful. Maritime routes may become less reliable. Settlements on Thera and perhaps other islands are disrupted. Coastal damage may affect ports. Agricultural stress, even if localized, constrain storage and redistribution. Earthquakes connected to the same restless geological region may add further damage. Fear itself can become a political force. A palace authority that once seemed capable of maintaining order may appear less certain when the earth shakes and the sea crosses its boundaries. Yet people do not simply stop living because history later calls their age a collapse. Farmers plant again, potters shape new vessels, families repair houses, officials count goods. Rituals continue, perhaps with greater urgency. Craftspeople adapt to new demands. Some communities may become more dependent on local resources if long-distance trade falters. Others may turn outward more aggressively, trying to restore lost connections. The slow nature of collapse is often hidden because ruins preserve endings better than efforts to continue. Archaeology shows the burned room. It struggles to show the years of anxiety before the fire, or the hands that rebuilt the doorway afterward. One lesser known and important detail is that the post-eruption Minoan world may still have looked impressive to many who lived within it. Decline is not always visible from inside. A palace court can host ceremonies while its economic base weakens. A storeroom can remain full in one season and fail in the next. Elite art can become more elaborate as power becomes more fragile, because display is one way authority reassures itself. To later observers, the cracks are obvious because the ending is known. To the people walking through the corridors, the future is not yet a ruin. It is a problem to be managed. The unevenness of collapse also means that different people experience it differently. An elite family tied to palace administration may feel political shifts before a farmer in a remote valley does. A coastal trader may feel the disruption of sea routes immediately, while a mountain community may notice more slowly through shortages, taxes, obligations, or changing ritual demands. A craft specialist dependent on imported materials may suffer if trade weakens. A local leader may gain power if central authority falters. For some, collapse is loss. For others, it may be opportunity. Civilizations do not fall evenly across the lives of everyone inside them. The Minoan palace system, for all its sophistication, may have been vulnerable because it concentrated many forms of authority in a few centers: storage, ritual, administration, craft production, and elite identity were closely tied to palace institutions. If those institutions are damaged physically or lose legitimacy socially, the effects ripple widely. A palace is not only a building, it is a promise that goods will move, ceremonies will matter, symbols will hold, and people will accept the order arranged around them. When that promise weakens, the walls may still stand, but the system inside them begins to change. No single explanation fully accounts for this unraveling. Nature provides shocks. Earthquakes damage buildings. Thera disrupts the sea and sky. Tsunamis may wound the coast. Economic networks shift. Mainland powers grow. Internal rivalries may sharpen. Religious confidence may be tested. Political authority may fragment or be captured by new groups. Each factor alone feels incomplete. Together, they create something more plausible, not one fatal blow, but a sequence of pressures striking a society whose strength depends on connection and coordination. This is why the Minoan collapse remains so fascinating. It is not merely a lesson that nature can destroy advanced societies, though nature certainly can. It is a subtler warning that disaster often works through systems. A volcano does not need to bury a palace to change the palace's future. A wave does not need to reach an inland throne room to weaken the authority seated there. A trade route does not need to disappear forever. It only needs to fail at the wrong time, for the wrong people. In a society already under strain, the Minoans endure the first shocks, but endurance is not the same as recovery. The island continues, yet it continues differently, and into that difference, from across the Aegean, comes the rising presence of another Bronze Age power, one whose language will eventually be readable on Crete, and whose arrival turns the mystery from natural disaster toward politics, rivalry, and survival under new masters. Across the Aegean, while Crete is absorbing shocks that are difficult to measure, mainland Greece is changing. The communities later called Mycenaean are becoming wealthier, more organized, and more ambitious. Their hilltop centers do not feel quite like the open, flowing palace world of Crete. Places such as Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos, and Thebes belong to a different atmosphere: fortified citadels, warrior graves, weapons, chariots, elite competition, and rulers whose power is easier to imagine in terms of military display. This contrast can be overstated, because the mainland also values trade, administration, craft, and ceremony. While Crete is not as peaceful or unarmed as older romantic images suggested, still, the difference in tone is real enough. As Minoan networks weaken or shift, Mycenaean influence grows more visible. and the balance of the Aegean begins to tilt. The old story often presents this as invasion. The volcano wounds Crete, the Minoans are helpless, and Mycenaean warriors sweep in to take control. It is dramatic, but the evidence does not allow such a simple picture. There may have been violence. There may have been armed takeovers at some sites. There may have been mainland groups moving into positions of power. But Mycenaean influence on Crete could also have spread through trade, intermarriage, elite imitation, political opportunism, migration, or alliances with local Cretan factions. Scholars still debate how much was conquest and how much was transformation from within. The archaeological record shows change, but it does not always show the exact human mechanism behind it. What can be seen is a growing Mycenaean presence in material culture and administration. Certain burial practices, pottery styles, weapons, and symbols begin to suggest stronger mainland connections. Most importantly, Linear B appears on Crete, especially at Knossos. Unlike Linear A, Linear B can be read, and it records an early form of Greek. This is one of the great turning points in the story. A script descended in part from earlier Aegean writing is now being used to write a language that is not Minoan, or at least not the language behind Linear A. The palace bureaucracy continues, but the voice within the administration has changed. It is as if the machinery of Cretan record-keeping has been taken up by new hands, or by old hands serving a new order. This does not mean that all Minoan culture disappears. Far from it. Mycenaean elites on the mainland had already admired and borrowed from Minoan art, luxury, and symbolism. The relationship between the two worlds is not simply conqueror and conquered. Mainland Greece absorbs many Cretan influences before it rises to dominance. Minoan motifs appear in Mycenaean art. Cretan craftsmanship affects mainland taste. Religious symbols, decorative styles, and administrative habits move across the sea. By the time Mycenaean power becomes visible on Crete, the Mycenaeans themselves have already been shaped by Minoan prestige. The rival is also an heir. This creates one of the most interesting contradictions of the late Minoan world. Crete may lose political independence, or at least lose the kind of authority its palace centres once held, while its cultural influence continues through those who replace or dominate it. A civilization can be defeated in one sense, and still survive inside the habits of another. Minoan forms do not vanish in a clean break. They are adapted, reused, reinterpreted, and sometimes stripped of their older meanings. A bull image may continue without carrying exactly the same ritual weight. A palace room may still host administration, but in a different language. A craft tradition may remain alive while serving new elites. The surface continuity can hide a deep shift in power. The evidence for violence is uneven. Destructions at some Cretan sites could reflect conflict, but fire alone does not prove invasion. Weapons appear, but weapons always require context. Mainland-style objects can indicate Mycenaean presence, but they can also indicate trade or local adoption of prestigious foreign styles. Earlier generations sometimes treated any Mycenaean-looking object as proof of Mycenaean conquerors. Modern archaeology is more cautious. Objects travel more easily than armies. Styles can be copied. Elites often adopt the symbols of rising powers without being physically replaced. At the same time, it would be equally careless to deny the possibility of force. The Late Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean is not a gentle world. Power is contested, and weakened systems invite pressure. A lesser-known detail is that the Mycenaean takeover, however it happened, may not have been uniform across Crete. Different regions likely experienced change in different ways. Knossos appears to remain a major administrative centre, while other palace sites decline or are destroyed. Some local communities may have negotiated with new authorities. Others may have resisted, withdrawn, or simply adapted because survival mattered more than cultural purity. Crete's mountains and regional divisions, which once helped shape its distinct palace centres, may have also shaped the uneven spread of Mycenaean control. The island is too large and too varied to imagine as a single door being kicked open. The rise of Mycenaean influence also forces a question about the Minoan elite themselves. Did some of them survive by joining the new order? It is possible. Conquest, when it happens, does not always replace every local official. New rulers often need people who know the land, the stores, the routes, the rituals, the labour obligations, and the practical machinery of administration. A Cretan scribe or local noble might serve a Mycenaean-speaking authority. A marriage alliance might convert old status into new loyalty. A religious office might continue because the people still trust it. What survives in the record suggests change, but not the complete erasure of local society. This is where the story of collapse becomes human again. To later historians, Minoan and Mycenaean are categories. To people living through the transition, identity may have been layered, negotiated, and practical. A craftsman may continue making familiar designs for new patrons. A farmer may owe goods to a different administrator but still plough the same field. A woman participating in ritual may use inherited gestures under altered political circumstances. A sailor may carry cargo for whoever controls the harbour. The names of powers change, but daily life does not always announce the change with a trumpet. Sometimes history enters quietly, through a new seal on a jar, a new style of cup in a storeroom, a new language on a tablet. No single explanation fully accounts for the Mycenaean rise on Crete. Nature weakens the island, economic networks shift, palace authority becomes vulnerable, mainland elites grow stronger, some form of political takeover occurs, whether by force, infiltration, alliance, or all of these at different places and times. The result is not the sudden death of Minoan Crete, but the end of its old dominance. The island that once shaped the Aegean begins to be shaped by forces it helped create. The palaces still matter, especially Knossos, but the world behind them is changing. The next layer of the mystery lies there, in the strange afterlife of Knossos, where Minoan walls, Mycenaean language, and Bronze Age administration meet in a civilization that is neither entirely what came before nor entirely what will come after. Knossos survives in a way that makes the Minoan ending harder to define. If the story were only destruction, Knossos would fall silent with the others, its painted rooms abandoned, its storerooms emptied, its courts left to dust and weeds while the island moved into darkness. But history is rarely so obedient. After the great shocks, after the eruption of Thera and the weakening of older palace networks, Knossos remains a centre of power. It is changed, perhaps deeply changed, but not erased. Its continued importance is one of the reasons the Minoan story feels less like a clean fall and more like a long transformation under pressure. In this later phase, the Palace of Knossos becomes associated with Linear B tablets, and those tablets change everything. Unlike Linear A, Linear B can be read. It records an early form of Greek, the language of Mycenaean administration. The tablets are not poetry. They are lists, accounts, allocations, names, livestock, grain, oil, textiles, bronze, chariot parts, offerings, personnel, and goods moving through a bureaucratic system. At first glance, this may seem dry compared with frescoes and myths, but bureaucracy is one of the most revealing kinds of evidence ancient societies leave behind. It shows what a ruling system watches. It shows what must be counted because it matters. It shows labour, storage, production, and control in motion. The presence of Linear B at Knossos suggests that, By this later period, Greek-speaking Mycenaean authority is operating on Crete, or at least that the palace administration uses a Mycenaean Greek language, but the building, the island, and many cultural forms around it remain deeply rooted in the older Cretan world. This creates a layered society. The administrative voice may be Mycenaean, while the physical and symbolic setting carries Minoan memory. Corridors, courts, storerooms, sacred symbols, inherited craft traditions, and local rituals do not vanish simply because a different language appears on clay. Power can change faster than culture. A new authority can occupy an old centre and rely on the very traditions it has displaced. The tablets from Knossos reveal a world still intensely organised. Sheep are counted in large numbers, pointing toward wool and textile production on a significant scale. Bronze is monitored, suggesting control of valuable metal resources. Chariot equipment appears in the records, connecting Knossos to the military and elite technologies of the Mycenaean world. Perfumed oil, offerings, vessels, and personnel move through the administrative system. The palace is not a romantic ruin at this stage. It is a working institution. Goods are still being gathered. People are still being assigned. Workshops still matter. The old palace machinery has not stopped. It has been redirected. One surprising detail is how temporary these tablets were likely meant to be. Many were not designed as permanent archives. They were working records, stored for immediate administrative use and perhaps discarded or recycled when no longer needed. They survived because fire baked them, just as earlier destructions preserved other clay records by accident. This means the readable voice of Mycenaean Knossos comes to us through catastrophe. The tablets are clear enough to reveal administration, but accidental enough to leave enormous gaps. They show the palace on certain days, in certain offices, tracking certain goods. They do not explain how power was seized, how local people felt about it, or whether old Minoan families still held influence beneath Mycenaean oversight. Cultural blending is visible not only in writing but in style and practice. Mycenaean elites had long admired Minoan forms, so the later world of Knossos is not a foreign occupation sealed off from local tradition. It is a hybrid Aegean culture. Some older religious symbols continue, artistic motifs endure, though sometimes altered. Minoan craftsmanship remains valued. The palace setting itself carries authority because of its past. A new power ruling from Knossos benefits from the aura of Knossos. To control the old centre is not merely to control storage rooms and workshops. It is to claim continuity with a place already charged by generations of ceremony, wealth, and memory. This is a common pattern in history. New rulers often do not destroy the symbols of older power if those symbols can be used. They stand in the same halls, adopt certain rituals, employ local specialists, preserve useful administrative habits, and present themselves as rightful heirs rather than simple intruders. On Crete, something like this may have happened, though the evidence remains incomplete. The Mycenaean presence at Knossos may represent conquest, elite replacement, negotiated takeover, or a gradual shift in which local and mainland powers become entangled. Whatever the mechanism, the result is not cultural emptiness. It is a changed order wearing some of the old colours. Still, survival should not be mistaken for continuity without loss. The older Minoan language behind Linear A no longer dominates the surviving records at Knossos. Other palace centres do not retain the same importance. The balance of Crete's regions changes. The island's relationship to the wider Aegean is altered. What had once seemed like a distinct Cretan-centred system becomes part of a Mycenaean political world. The old rituals may continue, but their meanings may shift under new authority. The same symbol can survive while the society around it changes so much that its original force becomes difficult to recover. Knossos, after the disaster, therefore stands as both survivor and witness. It proves that Minoan civilization was not simply annihilated by Thera. It also proves that the civilization did not continue unchanged. Its palace traditions become part of another system, one more closely tied to the mainland Greek world that will later feed into epic memory, heroic legend, and the distant background of classical Greece. Beneath that later inheritance lies the older island world, still visible but partially overwritten, like a fresco painted over and then cracked by time. There is something almost unsettling about this afterlife. The Minoans become harder to see precisely because pieces of them survive. If they had vanished completely, the story might be simpler. Instead, their art, symbols, administrative practices, and prestige flow into Mycenaean culture. Their identity dissolves into influence. Their palaces become stages for new languages. Their sacred forms continue under altered meanings. Their memory travels forward, not as a clear historical account, but as fragments, images, and perhaps distorted echoes. At Knossos, the old and new worlds meet in clay and stone. A scribe writes Greek signs in a palace shaped by Cretan tradition. Goods move through storerooms that recall earlier sisters of surplus and ceremony. The walls still carry traces of a civilization whose own words remain mostly unread. Nature has not erased Knossos. Politics has not erased it either, but both have changed what Knossos means. And over the centuries that follow, as Bronze Age memory fades into story, this layered place will become something even stranger, not only an archaeological site, but the imagined home of kings, monsters, mazes, and myths born from ruins. Long after the palace corridors of Knossos lose their original voices, stories begin to gather around them like vines growing over stone. The old Bronze Age world recedes. The administrative tablets fall silent. The people who once understood Linear A are gone, and even the later Mycenaean order collapses into its own age of disruption. Centuries pass. Memories change shape. Names survive detached from the systems that gave them meaning. Ruined walls become places of explanation, warning, and wonder. By the time Greek myth takes the form familiar to later generations, Crete is no longer remembered as a complex palace society of scribes, sailors, workshops, rituals, and shifting political authority. It becomes the island of Minos, the labyrinth, the Minotaur, Daedalus, Ariadne, Theseus, and a monster hidden beneath royal power. The myths are not archaeology, but they are not meaningless either. They are late, layered, poetic, and reshaped by generations of telling. They cannot be used as direct reports from the Minoan Bronze Age. No one should imagine that a literal half-human, half-bull creature waited in a real underground maze beneath Knossos. That belongs to myth, not history. Yet myths often grow around old landscapes, old ruins, old rituals, and old fears. They preserve emotional truths even when they distort factual ones. The evidence remains incomplete, but it is possible that later Greek stories about Crete carry faint echoes of a much older world: bull rituals, palace complexity, maritime power, tribute, elite authority, and the unsettling memory of a civilization that once seemed both magnificent and dangerous. Minos himself is a shadowed figure. In Greek tradition, he becomes a king of Crete, a lawgiver, a judge, a naval ruler, and sometimes a tyrant. The name may not refer to one historical person at all. It may have been a title, a dynastic memory, a mythic condensation of many rulers, or a later Greek attempt to explain the power of ancient Crete. Scholars still debate how much Bronze Age reality lies behind the figure. What matters is that later Greeks remembered Crete as a place that had once commanded the sea. The idea of a Cretan sea power may reflect some dim awareness of Minoan maritime influence, though myth turns networks of trade, prestige, and political reach into the simpler image of a king whose authority stretches across islands. The labyrinth is even more suggestive. The palace at Knossos, with its corridors, rooms, staircases as courts, storerooms, and levels, could easily appear maze-like to later visitors who no longer understood its design. Modern reconstructions and older excavation choices have intensified this impression, but the ancient complex itself was certainly intricate. A person unfamiliar with its organization might feel swallowed by passages and thresholds, moving through spaces that open, close, turn, rise, and descend. The myth of the labyrinth may preserve a memory of architectural complexity transformed into symbol. A palace becomes a maze. Administration becomes secrecy. Ritual danger becomes a monster hidden inside. The Minotaur, for all its impossibility, belongs to a symbolic world that makes sense around Crete. Minoan culture is filled with bull imagery. Bulls appear in art, ceremonial objects, and sacred signs. Bull-leaping scenes show human bodies meeting animal force in a charged and dangerous performance. Later Greek imagination may have inherited the image of Crete as a place where bulls mattered profoundly, then reshaped that memory into a darker tale. The graceful leap over the bull becomes the terror of being fed to the bullman, a ritual of control, initiation, or spectacle, becomes a story of tribute and death. No single explanation fully accounts for the transformation, but the connection between Minoan bull symbolism and later Cretan myth is difficult to ignore. The story of Theseus and Ariadne adds another layer. Athens, in the myth, sends young people to Crete as tribute, and Theseus becomes the hero who enters the labyrinth, kills the Minotaur, and escapes with Ariadne's help. This is not a neutral memory. It is a story told from the perspective of a Greek mainland world that has reasons to imagine freedom from Cretan dominance. If some memory of Minoan or Cretan power survived in later tradition, myth could invert it into a heroic liberation tale. Crete becomes the oppressive older power. Athens becomes the rising force that defeats it. History may not lie directly beneath the story, but political memory often works in such reversals. Daedalus, the craftsman, may also preserve something essential about how later people imagined Crete. He is the maker of impossible devices, the designer of the labyrinth, the artist whose skill borders on danger. This fits the after-image of Minoan civilization as a place of extraordinary craft-painted walls, carved seals, fine vessels, complex architecture, drainage systems, and carefully staged spaces. Later myth remembers Crete not only as powerful but as technically and artistically uncanny. Its wonders require a master maker. Yet Daedalus is also trapped by the power he serves, and his escape ends in the tragedy of Icarus. In that story, brilliance and disaster are inseparable, as they so often are in memories of lost civilizations. A lesser-known aspect of these myths is how much they may owe to ruins themselves. Ancient people lived among remains whose original builders were already distant. Massive walls, abandoned complexes, tombs, strange objects, and undeciphered signs invited explanation. A broken palace does not remain mute in human imagination. People name it, fear it, sanctify it, or turn it into a warning. The ruins of Bronze Age Crete may have worked on later minds in exactly this way, where archaeology sees phases of construction, destruction, and reuse. Myth sees kings, monsters, inventors, curses, and heroic escape. Both are attempts to make sense of what remains, but one measures and compares while the other remembers through story. There may also be drowned memories in the wider mythic atmosphere of Crete. The eruption of Thera, tsunamis, coastal disruption, and the collapse of an older world do not appear in Greek myth as a simple geological report, but stories of divine anger, sea journeys, lost power, monstrous tribute, and dangerous islands may carry faint emotional residues of Bronze Age disruptions. This must remain cautious. Popular theories sometimes try to connect every myth directly to a specific catastrophe, and that often goes beyond the evidence. Still, people remember disasters, especially when landscapes change and ruins remain. Over centuries, memory can lose dates and causes while preserving a feeling that something great stood here, that something terrible happened, that the past was powerful and not entirely safe. The myths born around Crete therefore do not solve the Minoan mystery, they deepen it. They show how the civilization continued to live after its political world had vanished, not through accurate history, but through transformation into legend. Minoan bull rituals become the Minotaur, palace complexity becomes the labyrinth, maritime prestige becomes the rule of Minos, craft brilliance becomes Daedalus, cultural memory becomes story, and story becomes one of the ways ruins survive when language fails. The Minoans, whose own script remains mostly unread, enter later imagination through symbols others reshape. Their final legacy is not only in ash layers, pottery, frescoes, and tablets. It is also in the strange persistence of images: a bull in the dark, a thread through a maze, a palace remembered as a place where civilization itself once became both beautiful and dangerous. What nature did not erase is, in the end, almost as important as what it destroyed. The eruption of Thera remains one of the most dramatic events in the Bronze Age Aegean, and it almost certainly changed the world around it. It buried Crete, sent ash and pumice across the sea, may have generated tsunamis that struck vulnerable coasts and forced every connected society nearby to reckon with a violence no palace could command. Yet the Minoan story is not simply the story of nature defeating civilization. It is the story of a society strong enough to survive shocks, fragile enough to be transformed by them, and mysterious enough that its final explanation still slips between geology, archaeology, politics, and memory. The old image of sudden annihilation has given way to something more complex. Crete was not buried like Crete. Knossos did not vanish immediately under volcanic ash. Minoan people did not disappear from the island as if swept from history in one wave. They continued to work, rebuild, worship, administer, trade, adapt, and remember. Some centres declined, some were destroyed, some traditions continued under altered conditions. Mycenaean Greek power eventually entered the island's administration, but even then the older Cretan world did not simply dissolve. It survived in symbols, craft habits, sacred forms, architectural authority, and the prestige of Knossos itself. Collapse here is not erasure. It is transformation under stress. This is why no single explanation fully accounts for the Minoan decline. The volcano matters, but it is not the whole story. Tsunamis may matter, but their reach and impact remain debated. Earthquakes matter, because Crete belongs to a restless tectonic world. Trade disruption matters, because the island's wealth depends on movement. Political rivalry matters, because palace societies are never only economic machines. They are human systems of authority, belief, obligation, and ambition. Mycenaean expansion matters, because weakened networks invite stronger neighbours. Internal change matters too, though it is the hardest to see. The evidence remains incomplete, but the pattern suggests a civilization struck not by one blade, but by many pressures cutting into the same fabric. The surprising lesson is that the Minoans may have been most vulnerable because they were advanced. Their palaces were sophisticated, but sophistication creates dependencies. Their ships connected them to distant worlds, but connection makes distant disaster local. Their administrative systems concentrated resources, but concentration can turn local damage into regional strain. Their rituals helped bind communities together, but rituals can be tested when earthquakes, waves, and political failures seem to break the old order. A simpler society might absorb some shocks by shrinking inward. A palace civilization must keep many parts moving at once. When too many movements falter, the structure can remain standing while its meaning changes. And yet, the Minoan achievement endures with unusual force. Their frescoes still feel alive after millennia of damage. Their pottery still carries the curve of the sea. Their palace courts still suggest gatherings whose words are gone. Their scripts still challenge modern scholarship. Their influence passes into Mycenaean culture, and then, indirectly and distantly, into the later Greek world. Their ruins feed myths that reshape memory into kings, mazes, monsters, and threads. Nature changed their history, but it did not remove them from time. Instead, it helped turn them into one of archaeology's most haunting civilizations, bright enough to see, silent enough to remain mysterious. In the end, the Minoans stand at the meeting point of beauty and warning. They show that civilization is not only walls, wealth, and art. It is trust in roots, trust in harvests, trust in institutions, trust in meanings, and trust that tomorrow's world will behave enough like yesterday's to be managed. When the earth shakes, when the sea rises, when trade falters, when rivals press in, that trust can weaken, but people continue. They repair, bargain, pray, count, sail, and begin again. Even when the shape of the old world is already slipping away, what nature did not erase, time transformed. The Minoans did not leave a clear farewell. They left ash-dark questions, painted fragments, unread signs, rebuilt walls, altered palaces, and stories that came later to explain what history had forgotten. Their island remains, long and mountainous, lying across the southern Aegean with harbours open to the same sea that once made it powerful and vulnerable. The waves have calmed. The volcano sleeps in its broken ring. The palace rooms are quiet. But the mystery still moves through them, like light crossing a frescoed wall. The story slows here, not because the mystery is solved, but because the island itself seems to ask for quiet. Crete remains under the sun, its mountains still rising above valleys where people continue to live among traces older than memory. The sea still changes colour through the day. It is blue in the morning, silver under wind, dark at evening, and almost black when clouds gather over the water. Somewhere beyond the horizon, Santorini holds its caldera open to the sky. Beautiful now in the way dangerous places can become beautiful after time has softened their edges. The Minoans are gone as a living civilization, but not as a presence. They remain in the curve of a painted dolphin, in the lifted horns of stone, in a tablet marked by a hand no one can fully hear, in a palace corridor that later minds turned into a maze. They remain in the reminder that no society, however graceful, can stand outside nature. The earth beneath the floor, the weather over the fields, the sea beyond the harbour, and the movements of other powers are always part of the story, whether people name them or not. And perhaps that is why this ancient island still holds attention. It does not offer the comfort of a single answer. It offers something closer to the truth of history, a world made by human skill, shaken by forces beyond human scale, and carried forward in fragments. The Minoans built, sailed, painted, counted, worshipped, stored, traded, and imagined. Then their world changed. Some of it broke, Some of it survived, some of it became myth. When the last light falls across the ruins of Knossos, the stones do not explain themselves. They simply hold the warmth a little longer, as if remembering footsteps that vanished thousands of years ago. Beyond them, the sea keeps moving, patient and indifferent, touching the same island that once trusted it with everything.